My presentation will be very brief. I will present to you my research project and some results because it's not finished. This project is called Appropriation of Ovide Decroly's Ideas within Brazilian New School Movement. This project is being developed inside my research group in Brazil. This research group is History of Education and Early Childhood Education. The objectives of the group is, the first objective is to contribute to reconstruct the history of public education in Brazil, particularly early childhood education. And the second objective of the research group is to propose new paths to work with early childhood education based on the cultural historical theory. So we work in both ways. We make historical research and we work with early childhood education now, trying to develop new ways to work with children in kindergartens using cultural historical theory. Most Economics, Vygotsky, and Leontiev ideas, together with the contemporary researchers from Denmark, Australia, and from Russia too. And this project is inside the history part of the group. So, my work here in Leuven has one objective, to develop a collaboration with Professor Mark Dipap and with Professor Frank Simon. Our idea was to get together to develop a project and to do another kind of collaboration in the future. So this is the first step. This project is a three-year project. I'm receiving financial support from several agents from Brazil. This project will continue to be financial in Brazil when I go back to Brazil. So the objective of this project is to apprehend and comprehend how Ovide Decroly's ideas were appropriated and transformed within the new school movement in Brazil. We have several questions that are guiding our work. The first question is, how and when did Decroly's ideas arrive in Brazil? The second question is, what were the preconditions of its arrival? Educational ideas, debates, social, cultural, and historical scenarios. The third question is, what role was asked it to play, Decroly's ideas, in Brazilian society? And the final question is, had Decroly's ideas been modified in order to be accepted as part of the educational landscape of Brazil? So these four questions are the main questions. Of course, that if we start working, other questions will appear. But this is the main ones. Which sources we will use for the development of the research? Educational journals, covering a period from 1914 to 1964, before our military dictatorship in Brazil. And these journals are Revista do Ensino, Educação, Escola Nova, Revista Educação, Revista da Escola Nova. These journals were very important for Brazilian history of education and for the dissemination of new school movement within Brazilian teachers. We will work with the translated works of Decroly and Ramai to Portuguese too, and photographs, educational materials like logbooks, exam books, manuals designed for teachers and for teachers' education. The idea is to cover not only the circulation of ideas, but also how they were implemented in classrooms, or what happened when they arrived in the classrooms. And for that we have two schools in Brazil that use Decroly's ideas, or at least they say that they use Decroly's ideas. One of the schools is a kindergarten school that has now 110 years. It is working, still working. and was one of the first schools to adopt Decrolys ideas. And the other school is a school designed for teacher education. This school has 105 years now too. But both schools worked with Decrolys ideas, so they have a lot of practical materials. They have games, they have a lot of different kind of things that we will use in the research in order to answer these questions. So, what is the timeline of the project? From September 2013 until July this year, the idea of being here is to gather sources for the research. What kind of source? Especially Decrolys books and Decrolys articles. And also some, how can I say, different things like getting the chance to see his real games at Decrolys archives, to see how he designed his games, his boxes, test boxes, and things like that. And to read and analyze, together with Mark and Frank, part of the findings that I have with me now. So to come here, I brought journals, articles from these journals, and these books translated from this Hamaid and Decrolys books translated, digitalized. So I brought all these materials for us to analyze together. So we are doing this, we are finishing our first analysis, our first joint analysis about the translations of Decrolys book. So these translations, they reveal just part of what happens when Decrolys ideas arrived in Brazil. We are finishing this work. We are working with a collection. This collection was published between 1929 and 1932. And it's composed by 4 translated and adapted books. These books, not only Decrolys and Hamaid books, but 4 translated and adapted books. One book that is aimed to be a description of a practical experience in a primary school in Brazil, and also Decrolys games adapted for Brazilian teachers. So the translated books of Decrolys are the books about the games. Em português, it is Iniciação à Atividade Intelectual Motora pelos Jogos Educativos. Decrolys Method from Amélie Hamaid, and the book about the tests from Decrolys and Ruiz. These are the Decrolys books and Hamaid books that were translated. Together with his books comes the translations of Pauline Kegomar book about the development of children between 2 and 6 years, and the Gué book about how to observe our students. It's a guide to work with natural science in primary schools. So we worked with this collection in order to understand what happened with the translations and why they choose this book to be translated to Portuguese at that time. In order to do that, we had to reconstruct the social and political environment and historical environment that support the translation of these books. And it's very interesting because Decrolys ideas, they entered in Brazil. The idea of the centers of interests, they entered in Brazil in 1922 with the first reform that was done in our education in Rio de Janeiro, the capital of Brazil at the time. And these ideas, they entered and they were used together with the intuitive method and the object lessons. Both of them were glued. So they used these ideas to modernize Brazilian education. And they continue using these ideas through the period of 1922 until 1927, when a second reform occurred in Rio de Janeiro, and the second reform explicitly used the centers of interest and referring to Decrolys ideas, using especially his categories association, expression, and globalization. So, to understand this context, we had to work with the two programs that were designed for teachers at that time, and in these programs they use Decrolys ideas and they make reference to the books that were translated. So they release these programs as an educational policy to be implemented in Rio de Janeiro, and after that the books were translated. So those books, they had, how can I say, they were politically and they were politically attached to the educational reform that took place in Rio de Janeiro at that time. And the agent of translation, the guy that edited the Paulo Leão, who edited the collection, he was an educational inspector in Rio de Janeiro, and he selected those books and he recommended those books to be used in teacher education in Rio de Janeiro. They were used because the major teacher education school, the major Escola Normal in Rio de Janeiro, had those books in their libraries, and those books were they really read those books, because those books, they were, how can I say, they were from the files from the library. They were really they really borrowed those books several times. I think that they are in between the 5 most borrowed books in the library. So we have finished this part, the comparison of the translated book with the original ones, and the findings are very interesting because these books were adapted, and the process of adaptation, they cut several parts of the books, trying to make the books more direct and more simple to be used as pedagogical tools by the teachers. And also they use these books as a bridge, a kind of a link, because they didn't thought at that time that Decroly was really pedagogue, a scholar that belonged to the new education movement. They viewed Decroly as part of the modern education, more related to the past than to the future. But they couldn't make this change very rapidly in Brazil, so they used Decroly as this bridge, this link between the object lessons that were used in Brazil since the end of the 19th century and the change for a new education. New education here, they considered at that time theory ideas. They will start to look into United States. So Decroly is in the middle, the translation of his book is in the middle of the process of abandon Europe, considered as not developed enough, and looking to United States as an example for Brazilian as a democratic country and as a very successful country in education. So Decroly books are in the middle of this debate. It's why they didn't give too much attention to his theory. They extract all the theoretical discussion that are in these books, even in Hamai's books. Although Hamai's book is a very practical book, they cut several parts of the book in order to make it more straightforward to the pedagogical practice. and so I'm summarizing, okay, because this is it's a very long discussion here. And in this first version of the synthesis, we work with the idea that Decrolys ideas, they were captured as not in its essence, but they were captured as part of this new education discourse that were arising in Brazil and mixed a lot of different ideas. Like in the programs, Decrolys concepts are mixed with Dewey, Kirchensteiner, sometimes Rubel, sometimes Pestalozzi. So they made this, how can I say, this big mixture, eclectic movement towards this new, what they considered new. And Decrolys was put inside this, this eclectic mixture. So it's why they didn't care if the ideas needed more information or not. They only wanted the practical tool of the centers of interest. So they looked at the centers of interest as a way to structure the pedagogical work in a different way. Several publications that came before the translation of these books, they just focus on the scheme that online books present of the centers of interest, dividing the themes that should be used during the whole year, just that. So we had two books. These books, they were sent to Decrolys after they've been published. I found in their account, they sent to Decrolys. These books, they just describe the themes of the centers of interest adapting to Brazilian reality and talking about the idea of globalization, the idea of associate ideas, but in a very, very simple way. Not putting together all the discussion that Decrolys has about child development or why working with associate ideas is important for developing children's intelligence or his emotional development too. So they didn't use. So this book had, the translation of these books, they had a great impact in Brazilian education at that time. And we made a discussion about the translations here, and this article that soon will be released. We use some theories to make this discussion about how the books were translated, why they cut or not some parts, what happened during the process of translation. And it is important that in this process of translation, the authors, the translators, they were primary teachers. So Paulo Maranhão, the editor, he chose primary teachers to make the translation. But why he chose primary teachers? Because during the process of the reform, the main actor of the reform, Fernando de Azevedo, who was the director of the instruction in Rio de Janeiro, he wanted to strengthen the relationship between the government and the teachers. So we are assuming here that Paulo Maranhão chose the teachers because the books would be better received if teachers view that a person that did the same work that they did made the translations. And these teachers try to, it's interesting because they didn't try to put examples of Brazilian reality inside the books. You don't have an adaptation, the sense that you will find Brazilian things in the books. No, they didn't do that. But I think that this relation, they try to create these strong ties between teachers and the government. The translations of the books at that time, they were severely criticized because most of the scholars, they thought that these books they were worthless because they considered Decrolys not advanced enough to change education in Brazil. But it's because these scholars, they were starting to look at the United States and leaving Europe, especially France, behind. But the books were, they read the book in the schools. This we know for sure. So this is the first part of the research that we are finished. We didn't finish yet. We are discussing these results, what I found in the books, and the path to the translation of the books. And we hope to finish that part to study how the centers of interests entered in Brazil, how they were appropriated by those educators, because they entered a little bit earlier than the translations of the books, but they had the same, how can I say, the same idea of working with a slogan, but not working with Decrolys ideas. Taking that slogan to try to modify education in Brazil, to make education more efficient, to modernize how we educated people at that time in our country. So I think in general that's it. I'm open to questions if you want to know more. So the timeline of the project is to develop this synthesis of the work. This one part of the synthesis is this article. Write one or two articles, and then I will continue the research in Brazil, working with these two schools, now trying to understand what happened after this reform movement inside the classrooms with the materials that we already collected in Brazil, but I wasn't able to bring to Belgium. Yes, thank you for your attention.
How you call it, the new school movement. What's it? Can you give an characteristic or say something more about it?
Okay. The new school movement is considered when the education starts to view child, to focus on child development, its necessities, and trying to move school from methodology, its methodology and how can I say, its practice to how can I say, to adapt school to children's necessity.
It was a kind of a reform movement around 1900, and a lot of names
like Montessori, Decrolys,
more of a child-centered.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I knew the child-centered, but I didn't know the term new school movement.
They also call it new school movement. In France, they call it éducation nouvelle. New school.
Active school.
Sudbury is included.
Sorry?
Sudbury.
No.
Sorry,
that comes a bit later.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much later. It's really the movement that centers around 1900. It starts at the end of the 19th century and it kind of ends in the 30s.
And it's very child-centered.
Absolutely, yeah, because they all of the proponents, they criticized the old-fashioned way to give shape to education, which placed the teacher at the center.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, I
have a question about the general project. For example, you finish this stage and then you go to see the school, right? The next stage. But the general aim is to understand in order to change or to improve or...
No. This is the research group. Because my research group works in two fields, history of education and early childhood education.
Yeah.
So they are separate things. They are, no, that's okay. And the second aim of my research group is to, we actually work directly with early childhood education. We have now 7 books published about methodology and child development that are, we are looking to how to improve the way teachers work in early childhood education now in Brazil.
But that's my question, because you are taking as cases one school and also one teacher education institution.
No, this is a separate. Because first I presented my research group.
You will see only
the researches that I'm doing here is other thing.
Yeah.
But we will look at 2 schools, but the documents of the schools and the documents, what happened in the past between 1914 and 1964, during this period.
Yeah, and with that, with those results, the idea is to see, for example, what was there, what was wrong, what was right, and then try to improve the practices of that school. That's a general aim. No,
the idea is to understand how Decrolys ideas were used, what happened. Because these 2 schools, they respond to a reform action. So they try to implement what the reform asked them. So what happened? They really implemented? No, what happened? They work with the centers of interest. If they work, what happened with the centers of interest? So this is the idea, to you inside, it's difficult, but try to understand what happened when this reforms achieved school, when they arrived at school. What teachers did with all this material.
Thank you very much.
I just wondered whether the case you presented now is kind of special in this respect, that the move that you described from a kind of a European attitude towards a more American attitude in educational thinking, is that something you also could find in other domains, in other scientific subjects? Was this a kind of a general atmosphere in Brazil at that time? And what were the reasons for that? I mean, I can imagine that up till a particular moment, all the intellectuals, they looked towards the east, and then all of a sudden they looked towards the north. What makes this change of gaze? What can explain this kind of change?
Because in Brazil at that time we were starting our industrialization process, which was, how can I say, a late industrialization process. We are at the beginning of the 20th century when it starts. So when started our industrialization process, and at that time they were, in the test I comment about this, they are discussing about our republican. And they are very, how can I say, disappointed with the republic that we built until 1910, for example, 1920. They are very disappointed because it didn't brought, how can I say, development to the country. So they, several of these intellectuals start to travel around the world. They come to Europe. They go to United States, and once they arrive in the United States, they start to view United States as a more developed nation than the nations in Europe. And of course, we have our economical ties that start to get strong with United States. So it was a kind of general movement trying to make our republic our republic, like the republic that they had in the United States at that time.
Do you think it also could have to do with the fact that at that moment they tried to get rid of a particular kind of colonial history, kind of colonial ties between European mainland and...
In a certain way, yes.
Was the fact that they looked towards the United States, was it a kind of a critical gesture towards Europe?
In a certain way it was.
Yeah.
Because after the proclamation of the Republic, Brazil still had...
When was that? Sorry. Yeah.
I
do not know. Was it in the 19th century?
It was in the 19th century. So when they had the proclamation process, they started to looking for a way to modernize the country, but they were still looking at Europe, not exactly Portugal, but they were looking at France to establish our educational system. Until now, our education system is very similar to France. Okay, they started looking for that, but our practical problems, our how can I say, the problems that we had with people, economical problems and problems that were not solved, like what to do with the slaves after the abolition of slavery. So these problems were not solved, and at that time this problem starts to explode. And the country, we had several how can I say, doctors and intellectuals that start to travel around Brazil to see what happened after the Republic was proclaimed. And the reviews of what happened were very scary, because we had a lot of people very sick, living in a very bad condition. 80% of the population was illiterate. So this whole scenario made them to look for another model, not Europe anymore.
I have one more question, and this has to do with the fact that Ovide Decroly here in Belgium, he was involved both in normal education as in special education. The combination for him was kind of important. Is that also something that you found in Brazil, or is this completely separate?
It's very funny, because this book about the games, the subtitle in French is a book dedicated to children with disabilities. Yes. In Portuguese they cut off the subtitle because they used only for the normal children. At that time, imagine, we didn't even have discussion, how can I say, a real discussion about disability. No, because we didn't have school for everybody. 80% was illiterate. Majority of the children was out of school. They were starting to discuss the mass education process in Brazil. At the same time, they were trying to change the way education was done until then. So so Decrolys came for the educationalization process in Brazil. So they didn't discuss him. And he came together. It's funny because it's mixture with most mixed with Montessori ideas, especially with Montessori. He and Montessori, they came very close. They were very close. Although Ramai made in her book a very hard critic to Montessori methods.
Did you also see Montessori as represents more as the old school, like you said?
Not exactly. A kind of. The problem is that Montessori was widely disseminated in Brazil because of the Catholic Church. So we had a lot of Catholic schools. We have until now a lot of Catholic schools that use Montessori method. So she was disseminated in this, and the Catholics, they had a lot of private schools and also, how can I say, charity schools in Brazil. So they mixed both. What the scholars at that time they thought was that Decroly needed something to improve his methodology, and Montessori was that something that will improve his methodology. Because she had more games, more things to use with children. So they used the idea of centers of interest together with Montessori games, for example. They mix both.
Okay. Any other question you would like to ask? Alessandra? If you do not have one right now, you have the time until the beginning of July in order to pose the question to Alessandra, because that is the time that you will go back to Brazil. I just wanted to thank you for the presentation, and I wish you all the luck with developing the research in the nearby future.
Thank you.
Okay.